Let's bow our heads for a moment of prayer as we get ready to interpret God's holy word. Dear God, we thank you for the opportunity to come here together as your people and to hear your word spoken to us. We pray that we receive the message that you intend to speak to us today. And may the words of my mouth, meditations of all the hearts present here, be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One of my all-time favorite preachers was Fred Craddock, who recently passed away. He was one of America's greatest preachers, and he was known for his wonderful, good-humored stories. And at that workshop I took with him a number of years ago, he did not disappoint us because he told a story about being authentic in one's faith and how vital it is to match one's words with one's actions. Fred shared with us a story about a time that he was a guest preacher at a church in a large city, and on Sunday morning before heading over to church, he found a local restaurant to have a breakfast. And shortly after he sat down at his table, a young couple and their family was seated at the table next to him. The man and his wife were in their mid-30s. The husband had on a suit and a tie, and the wife had a dress on. And they had 3 children, a boy and a girl who looked to be about 6 and 8, and a darling little baby girl about 9 months old. And it was clear, like Fred, they too were getting a bite to eat before heading off to worship. Well, from the moment the family sat down, there was that usual commotion that comes with a young family, a little bit of extra noise, a few squeals by the baby. But Fred noticed that there was something different. It was the attitude of the young father. As his wife frantically tried to keep control of the children, the husband did absolutely nothing to help. Their young boy needed to go to the restroom, and the father curtly told them where it was located. He noticed that the baby's diaper needed changing and immediately barked at his wife to take care of it. In fact, he was constantly raising his voice to the children, threatening to give them the what for when they got home. The service was too slow, the coffee wasn't hot enough, the food was subpar, and as they ate, the father was constantly informing his family to hurry up and eat or they would be late. And when he was done with his food, he told them it was time to go. The wife was only halfway through her meal, the children were still eating their food. "It's time to go," bellowed the man. "I don't want to be late for church." They hurried out the door, the mother carrying the young child in the large baby bag, and the kids climbed into the car, and the father slammed the door, got in, and waited impatiently for his wife, and she was placing the youngest in the car seat, and as soon as the wife was in, the car raced out of the parking lot on its way to church. And as he watched them leave, Fred prayed that the young father might really listen to the sermon that morning, although he had his doubts. When our words don't line up with our actions, it's not usually a very pretty sight. The Epistle of 1 John is thought to be the first commentary on the Gospel of John. And in many ways, the short letter is all about authenticity, all about matching your faith with what you do in your life. What we do makes a huge difference. And what we do comes from our imitation of Jesus Christ. The author of 1 John says that if we know anything about love, it is because Christ laid down his life for us. We hear this in the gospel lesson today. Like a good shepherd, Jesus willingly puts his life down to protect his sheep. He risks all, sacrifices whatever is necessary, gives unconditional, unceasing, most of the time unmerited love. And as much as that Gospel of John speaks about faith and believing and seeing and Jesus as the way and the truth and the life, the author of 1 John reminds us that following Christ is not just about what we believe with our heads, but what we do with our bodies. The late great theologian Marcus Ward reminds us that the great commandment is not you should believe your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, but you should love God. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And sometimes we get caught up in what someone believes rather than the focus on what it should be, which is what we commit ourselves to, what we are willing to pledge ourselves to. And what really transforms us and changes us as people is who and what we love. And so it is that the author of 1 John reminds us that our faith is a matter of the heart. God's love can abide in us when we love the world as Christ has shown us. And so he writes, how does God's love abide in anyone who has all of the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. For the writer of this little letter, 1 John, Christianity has embedded within it an ethical dimension. To be a Christian is to be in harmony with one's neighbors, especially those who are struggling. And for us as Christians, we know that our faith is never just about words, but about our actions. You may have heard that old story of a rabbi and his students, and the students were questioning the rabbi as when they could recognize daybreak. And one suggested that it would be when color could first be distinguished between black and white. The rabbi said no. And another suggested dawn would be when you could distinguish a person from an animal. And again, the rabbi said no. And the third one said, well, Rabbi, tell us when we know that the day has come. And the rabbi replied, day has come when you can look at the face of another and recognize your brother and your sister. We cannot love our neighbor unless we are willing to open up our hearts. And the author of 1 John says that part of being a Christian is to open your hearts wide to allow God's love to abide within you, and then to love the world as God does and as Christ has showed us. You know, one of the main reasons that the author of 1 John wrote these words is because he was afraid that many faithful people were focusing just on the spiritual and not the material. The author reminds us that our faith has to do with ethics. That is the way that you and I live our life. I heard a story the other day, a true story, in the waning years of the Depression in a small southeastern Idaho community. There used to be a roadside stand for farm fresh vegetables, and it was run by a guy by the name of Mr. Miller. And food and money were still extremely scarce, and bartering was used extensively. And one particular day, Mr. Miller was bagging some early potatoes for a customer when this small boy, who was very delicate in bone and feature, he was ragged, but he was clean, was hungrily appraising a basket of freshly picked green peas. And after her purchase, the customer overheard Mr. Miller talking with this raggedly dressed little boy. "Hello, Barry, how are you today?" "Oh, Mr. Miller, fine. Thank you. Just admiring them peas. They sure look good." "They are good, Barry. How's your mom?" "Fine. She's getting stronger every day." "Good. Is there anything I can help you with?" "No, sir, just admiring them peas." "Would you like to take some home?" "No, sir, I got nothing to pay them with." "Well, what if you could trade me for some of those peas?" All I have is my prize marble. Is that right? Let me see it. Here it is. She's a dandy. Oh, I can see that. The only thing is that this one is blue, and I kind of like red. Do you have a red one like this at home? Well, not exactly, but almost. I'll tell you what, you take this sack of peas home with you, and the next trip this way, you let me look at that red marble. Sure will. Thanks, Mr. Miller. And Mrs. Miller, who had been standing nearby, came over to the customer and said with a smile, there are 2 other boys like that in the community, all 3 of them in poor circumstances. And Dave just loves to bargain with them for peas or apples or tomatoes or whatever. And whenever they come back with their red marbles, and they always do, he decides that he doesn't love bread after all, and he sends them home with a bag of produce for a green marble or an orange one perhaps. Years later, Mr. Miller passed away, and at the funeral home there was a viewing, and many friends and relatives were present to pay their respects. And in the line there were 3 young men. And one was in an army uniform, the other 2 looked very nice in suits, very professional looking. And they approached Mrs. Miller, and they stood there, and they smiled, and they were composed. And each young man hugged her and kissed her on the cheek and spoke briefly to her, and they moved on to the casket. And her misty light blue eyes followed them, and as one by one each young man stopped briefly, and he placed a hand on the casket, and each one of them left the funeral home awkwardly, wiping their eyes. Those 3 young men were the boys that Dave had traded with. And now, at last, when Dave could no longer change his mind about the color or the size, they came to pay their debt. And beneath Dave's hand were 3 magnificent, shiny red marbles. Dave and his wife never had a great deal of wealth by the world's standards, but Dave always considered himself to be the richest man in Idaho. The way you live your life makes a difference. As each of us follow Christ, we hope that we can open wide our hearts to receive the love of God, a love that is shown in empathy and compassion, mercy, and forgiveness. And may our faith be lived out not just in word or speech alone, but may others know the truth that we live by our actions of love. Amen.